Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here. So happy you're with me. Before we start, tell me, do you prefer listening to our mysteries late at night, early in the morning, or during a quiet afternoon moment? Your answers always warm my heart, and do subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, settle in. It's time for tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Corporate Laird. The fog came rolling in from the Atlantic like a living thing, thick and damp and cold as the grave. It crept through the narrow streets of Lochdoub, muffling the sound of the waves against the harbour wall and turning the whitewashed cottages into ghostly shapes. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his Croft House police station, watching the fog advance with the satisfaction of a man who knows that bad weather means people will stay indoors and leave him in peace. He was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and a thatch of red hair that refused to lie flat no matter how much he combed it. His regulation police uniform hung loosely on his lanky frame, and his expression was one of lazy contentment. The fog meant no one would be speeding through the village, no one would be fighting outside the pub, and no one would be bothering him with complaints about Mrs. McLean's cockerel crowing at dawn. Perfect. Behind him, he heard the scrabble of claws on linoleum. Lugs, his dog, a peculiar mixture of breeds that had resulted in a yellowish-brown coat and enormous ears that stuck out on either side of his head like jug handles, trotted up and pressed his cold nose against Hamish's hand. "Aye, I know," Hamish said, reaching down to scratch behind those ridiculous ears. "It's cold enough to freeze the horns off a Highland cow. We'll get the fire built up in a minute." A low rumbling sound came from the kitchen. Sonsi, the wildcat, was demanding her dinner. Hamish had found her as a kitten, half-starved and wild, and against all advice and common sense had taken her in. She was supposed to be domesticated now, though Hamish suspected she only tolerated him because he fed her regularly and kept the fire warm. He closed the door against the creeping fog and went to tend to his animals. The police station was quiet, the radio silent, the phone stubbornly refusing to ring, just the way Hamish liked it. He had just settled into his favourite chair with a cup of tea and the latest farming journal when he heard the rumble of an expensive car engine outside. Hamish frowned. No one in Lochdoub drove a car that sounded like that. He peered through the window and saw a sleek black Range Rover pulling up outside the Napoli, the village's Italian restaurant, which also served as the local pub. "That'll be himself," Hamish muttered to Lugs, "the new laird of Castle Krag." The news had been filtering through the village for weeks. Castle Krag, the ancient fortress that sat on the headland overlooking the loch, had been sold. Not to a nice American looking for a romantic Highland retreat, not to a retired couple wanting peace and quiet, but to some London businessman who, according to the rumours, had more money than sense and a personality to match. Hamish watched as a man emerged from the Range Rover. He was short and stocky, dressed in an expensive tweed jacket that looked brand new, the kind of thing tourists bought in Edinburgh thinking it made them look Scottish. His face was red and fleshy, and even from a distance Hamish could see the arrogant set to his jaw. Julian Vane, corporate auditor, Londoner, and by all accounts, a complete and utter pillock. Hamish sighed. He had a bad feeling about this. By evening, that bad feeling had crystallised into certainty. Hamish was sitting at his usual spot at the bar in the Napoli, nursing a dram of whisky and listening to Archie McLean complain about his wife's latest housekeeping demands, when Julian Vane made his entrance. The man swept in like he owned the place, which, Hamish reflected grimly, he probably thought he did. Vane's voice carried across the pub, loud and braying, the kind of English accent that made Highlanders instinctively reach for their claymores. "What an absolutely charming little establishment," Vane announced to no one in particular. "Very quaint, very rustic, like stepping back in time to when people didn't know any better." The pub fell silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Vane didn't notice, or didn't care. He strode up to the bar and rapped his knuckles on the wood. "You there, barman, I'll have a whisky," A proper one, mind you, not whatever local rot gut you serve the regulars. The barman, a patient man named Ian, set down a glass with admirable restraint. Vane took a sip and grimaced. Good God! Or is this what passes for whiskey up here? He turned to survey the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled villagers with barely concealed contempt. Now then, I suppose you're all wondering about the changes I'll be making to Castle Krag. We were not, said Archie MacLean quietly. Vane ignored him. First order of business, those ramshackle harbour sheds. Terrible eyesores. I've had my solicitor look into the deeds, and it turns out most of them are completely invalid. Built on castle land without proper permission. I'll be serving notice to have them removed. The silence deepened. The harbour sheds were where the fishermen stored their gear, where the boat builders kept their tools, where generations of Lochdoub men had worked. You canny do that, Archie said, his face reddening. Oh, but I can, Vane said cheerfully. I've already spoken to my lawyers. Those sheds will be gone by spring, and good riddance. Then we can develop the waterfront properly. Perhaps a nice marina for yachts. Bring in a better class of people. The muttering started then, low and dangerous. Hamish could see Archie's hands clenching into fists. He could see Dr. Brodie's face turning pale. He could see trouble brewing like the fog outside. And then, cutting through the rising tension like a knife through butter, came a soft, gentle voice. Oh my! What a frightful misunderstanding. Mrs. Moira Stewart stood in the doorway, still wearing her schoolteacher's cardigan and sensible shoes. She was a small woman, somewhere in her 50s, with soft grey eyes and hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had the kind of face that made children trust her, and the kind of voice that made angry men pause. "Mr. Vane, is it?" she said, moving forward with a sweet smile. "I'm Moira Stewart, the village schoolteacher. I do think there's been some confusion about those property deeds. Perhaps if you'd allow me to show you the historical records, we could clear this up. I've made quite a study of local history, you see." Vane looked at her with barely concealed impatience. "I don't need a history lesson from a village school marm. I need people to understand that things are going to change around here." Of course, Moira said, still smiling that patient smile. "But perhaps we could discuss it over a nice cup of tea. Everyone's a bit overwrought just now. Why don't I make a pot? And we can all calm down?" She moved among the villagers like a shepherd among sheep, gently urging them back to their seats, patting shoulders, murmuring soothing words. Hamish watched her with grudging admiration. The woman had a gift for diffusing situations. Within minutes she had tea brewing and was serving it round with slices of shortbread. Even Vane accepted a cup, though he continued to hold forth about his plans for modernising the village. Hamish drained his whiskey and stood up. Time to go home before he said something he'd regret. As he headed for the door, Moira caught his arm. "Constable Macbeth," she said softly, "I thought you might appreciate these. Fresh baked this afternoon." She pressed a basket of warm scones into his hands. They smelled of butter and currants and the kind of care that only came from someone who genuinely enjoyed feeding people. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Stewart," Hamish said. "Not at all. You work so hard keeping us all safe. It's the least I can do." Her grey eyes were warm and sincere. "And don't worry about Mr. Vane. I'm sure once he settles in, he'll see reason." Hamish nodded, though he doubted it. Men like Vane didn't see reason. They saw what they wanted and took it. He walked back through the fog to his police station, lugs trotting at his heels. The scones were still warm in their basket. Somewhere out on the loch, a foghorn moaned its warning. Hamish had the distinct feeling that the peace he so cherished was about to be shattered. He was right. Chapter 2. Death in the Locked Library. Hamish was awakened at 6:30 by the insistent ringing of the telephone. He groaned and pulled the pillow over his head, hoping whoever it was would give up and go away. The phone continued to ring. Lugs whined from his basket by the fire. Sonsy opened one yellow eye and glared at Hamish as if the noise was personally his fault. All right, Hamish muttered, stumbling out of bed and padding across the cold floor in his bare feet. He picked up the receiver. "Macbeth." "Hamish." You better get yourself up to Castle Krag right away." It was Dr. Brodie, and his voice was tight with shock. "There's been a death." Hamish was instantly awake. "Who?" "Julian Vane. The housekeeper found him an hour ago. She's in a terrible state. I've done what I can." "Saw her, but you need to see this." 20 minutes later, Hamish pulled up outside Castle Krag in his ancient police Land Rover. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the castle in all its grim glory. It was a proper Highland fortress, all grey stone and narrow windows, perched on the headland like a bird of prey surveying its territory. Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, sat in the kitchen wrapped in a blanket despite the roaring fire in the hearth. She was a stout woman in her 60s, normally as solid as the castle itself, but now she was shaking like a leaf. "I just went in with his morning coffee," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The door was bolted from the inside, so I knocked and knocked, and when he didn't answer, I got Mr. Murray to break it down, and there he was, lying on the floor with his head all—" She couldn't finish. Dr. Brodie handed her a cup of tea heavily laced with brandy. "The library," Brodie said to Hamish. "I haven't touched anything except to confirm he was dead. Been dead for hours, I'd say, since last night." Hamish followed the doctor through the castle's draughty corridors. The place smelled of damp stone and old wood and something else, something faintly metallic that Hamish recognised as blood. The library was exactly the kind of room you'd expect in a Highland castle. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, heavy oak furniture, a massive fireplace, and narrow windows that let in precious little light. And in the middle of the Turkish carpet, Julian Vane lay on his back, his expensive jacket soaked with blood, his skull crushed by the heavy cast-iron peat cutter that lay beside him. Hamish crouched down, careful not to disturb anything. The peat cutter was an antique, the kind that had been used for centuries to cut blocks of peat from the Highland bogs. It was heavy enough to brain an ox, let alone a man. "The door," Hamish said, standing up. "You said it was bolted from the inside?" "Aye," said Brodie. "A solid iron bolt thrown across. We had to put our shoulders to it to break the wood around the lock. There's no other way out. I checked the windows myself. All locked from the inside, and the drop from here to the ground is 30 feet onto solid rock." Hamish walked slowly around the room, his mind working. This was the kind of puzzle that would normally have delighted him, but there was something about the whole business that made him uneasy. A locked-room mystery in a Highland castle. It was almost too neat, too theatrical. He was examining the fireplace, wondering if someone could have climbed down the chimney like Father Christmas, when he heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Many vehicles. And then a voice that made his heart sink. "Where is the body? Stand aside, woman. I'm Detective Chief Inspector Blair, and I'm here to solve this murder." Hamish closed his eyes and sighed. This day had just gone from bad to worse. Detective Chief Inspector Blair burst into the library like a small red-faced avalanche. He was a fat man with a permanently florid complexion that spoke of too much whiskey and not enough exercise. Behind him trailed Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, looking apologetic, and a gaggle of forensics officers. "Macbeth," Blair barked. "What are you doing contaminating my crime scene?" "I was called here by Dr. Brodie," Hamish said mildly. "This is my patch, sir. I was securing the scene." "Securing the scene?" Blair's laugh was like a bark. "You wouldn't know how to secure a scene if it came with a padlock and instructions. Get out of my way." He shouldered past Hamish and stood over the body, his hands on his hips. "Right then, clear case of murder. Victim bashed over the head with that there peat cutter. Murderer is obviously one of the locals. That vain fellow made a lot of enemies last night at the pub, from what I hear. Shouldn't be hard to round up the usual suspects and get a confession." "The door was bolted from the inside," Hamish pointed out. "So?" Blair glared at him. "Obviously someone was clever enough to make it look like a locked room. Or maybe Vane bolted it himself and the killer was already in here. Either way, it's just Highland savages unable to control their tempers. I'll have this wrapped up by tea time." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a slight shake of his head. They both knew Blair would charge in like a bull in a china shop, arrest the wrong person, and cause untold damage in the process. The forensics team began their work, photographing the scene, dusting for fingerprints, carefully bagging the murder weapon. Hamish watched from the doorway, noting everything. The position of the body, the angle of the wound, the fact that there was remarkably little blood spatter for such a violent blow, suggesting Vane had been struck from behind while bending forward, perhaps looking at something on the lower shelves. "You still here?" "Macbeth?" Blair snapped. "Go on, get back to your sheep and your lazy ways. Leave real police work to real police officers." Hamish was about to leave when he heard a gentle voice in the corridor. Oh dear, what a terrible tragedy!" Moira Stewart appeared in the doorway carrying a large basket. She looked pale but composed, her grey eyes wide with concern. "Mrs. Stewart," Blair said, his tone changing to something almost resembling politeness. Women of a certain age and respectability always had that effect on him. "This is a crime scene, madam. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." "Of course, Chief Inspector. I just heard the news in the village and thought the poor officers might need some sustenance. I've brought coffee and sandwiches." She set the basket down on a table in the corridor. "And I took the liberty of preparing a list." "A list?" Blair's eyes lit up. Lists meant organisation, and organisation meant he could look competent. "Of everyone who was at the pub last night when Mr. Vane made his unfortunate remarks about the harbour sheds. I thought it might be helpful." She pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from her cardigan pocket and handed it to Blair. "As village school teacher, I make it my business to know everyone in Lochdubh. I've noted who had the most heated exchanges with the deceased." Blair took the list like a child receiving a sweet. "Very civic-minded of you, Mrs. Stewart. This is exactly the kind of community cooperation we need." "I do hope you'll be gentle with them, Chief Inspector. They're good people, really. They just felt threatened by Mr. Vane's plans." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Such a dreadful thing to happen. Poor Mr. Vane. Whatever his faults, he didn't deserve this." Hamish watched her carefully. She was saying all the right things, looking appropriately distressed, being helpfully cooperative, and yet something about it felt rehearsed, like a performance she'd practiced. "Don't you worry, madam," Blair said pompously. "I'll get to the bottom of this. These Highland types think they can get away with murder just because they're in the back of beyond, but they're dealing with a professional now." Moira gave him a tremulous smile and withdrew, leaving behind the basket of refreshments and that all-important list. Blair immediately began barking orders. "Anderson, get this list to the instant room. I want every one of these people brought in for questioning. Start with this Archie McLean. According to Mrs. Stewart, he had the most violent altercation with the victim." "Sir," Jimmy said carefully, "shouldn't we wait for the forensics report? And what about the locked door?" "The locked door is a red herring," Blair announced confidently. "Some clever attempt to throw us off the scent. Won't work on me, though. I've been doing this job since before you were born, Anderson. Now get moving." As the Strathbane detectives bustled about, Hamish slipped quietly away. He had work to do, and he couldn't do it with Blair breathing down his neck. Outside, he found Moira Stewart standing by her small car, staring up at the castle with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That was very helpful, what you did in there," Hamish said. She turned to him with a start, then smiled. "Oh, Constable Macbeth, I just wanted to help. This is such a shock to the whole village." "Aye, it is that." He studied her face. "You knew the castle well, I suppose, being the local historian." "Oh, yes. I've given tours here for years when the previous owner allowed it. Such a fascinating history. Did you know it dates back to the 14th century? There are passages and priest holes and all sorts of secrets hidden in these old walls." "Is that so?" Hamish said thoughtfully. "Indeed. I've made quite a study of it." She glanced at her watch. "Goodness, I must get to the school. The children will be wondering where I am. If there's anything else I can do to help, Constable, please don't hesitate to ask." She drove off, leaving Hamish standing in the cold morning air, watching the castle and thinking about locked rooms and helpful school teachers and murders that were just a little too convenient. His mobile phone rang. It was the station. "Hamish," said the tinny voice of the desk sergeant from Strathbane. "Blair wants you to know he's made an arrest. Archie McLean. Caught him trying to leave the village this morning. Blair says it's an open and shut case. Hamish sighed. This was going to be a long day. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. The arrest of Archie McLean had sent shockwaves through Lochdoub. By noon, the entire village was buzzing with indignation. Hamish knew he had to move quickly if he was going to save the fishermen from Blair's eagerness to close the case. The problem was that Blair had seized all the official evidence and barred Hamish from the investigation, which meant Hamish would have to do what he did best, rely on the village grapevine and his own knowledge of human nature. He started, as he often did, with the Curry twins. Nessie and Jessie Curry were spinster sisters who lived in a neat cottage overlooking the harbour. They were identical in appearance, both small and bird-like with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, and they had the peculiar habit of repeating each other's phrases. Hamish found them in their front garden, ostensibly weeding the flower beds, but actually watching the comings and goings at the harbour with the intensity of surveillance cameras. "Ladies," Hamish said, tipping his cap. "A word, if you have a moment." "Of course, Constable," Nessie said. "Of course, Constable," Jessie echoed. "I'm trying to piece together Mr. Vane's movements the day before he died. Did either of you see him around the village?" The sisters exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We did see him," Nessie said. "We did see him," Jessie repeated. "Down by the harbour in the afternoon." "Down by the harbour in the afternoon." "Having words with a young man?" "Having words with a young man," Hamish's interest sharpened. "A young man? What did he look like?" "Tall he was," Nessie said. Well dressed. City clothes, not local. City clothes, not local. And they were arguing fierce," Nessie continued. "We couldn't hear what about, but the young man was red in the face, jabbing his finger at Mr. Vane." "Jabbing his finger at Mr. Vane. Any idea who he was?" The sisters shook their heads in unison, a movement so synchronized it was almost eerie. "Never seen him before," Nessie said. "Never seen him before." Hamish thanked them and moved on. A mysterious stranger arguing with the victim the day before his death. That was interesting, but it could be anything. Vane seemed to have made a career out of arguing with people. His next stop was Angus MacDonald's cottage, perched on the hillside above the village. Angus was ancient, with a face like weathered leather, and eyes that some said could see the future. Hamish privately thought the old man was as much a seer as Lugs was a pedigree hound. But Angus had his uses. He knew everyone's business, heard every whisper of gossip, and remembered everything. "I've been expecting you," Angus said when Hamish knocked on his door. "Have you now?" Hamish said dryly. "Did the spirits tell you I was coming, or did you see my Land Rover from your window?" Angus gave him a gap-toothed grin. "You're a terrible cynic, Hamish Macbeth. No respect for the old ways. I respect you enough to know you hear everything that happens in this village. What can you tell me about Julian Vane?" The old man settled into his chair by the fire and lit his pipe. Nasty piece of work, that one. Making enemies faster than a politician at election time. But you knew that already. The young man the Currys saw him arguing with. Any idea who that might be? Angus puffed thoughtfully. Could be his nephew, Callum Vane. Came up from Edinburgh 2 days ago, asking around for his uncle. Stayed one night at the hotel in Strathbane, then left yesterday morning. Or so I heard. A nephew? Hamish filed that away. What else have you heard? Plenty. Dr. Brodie was white as a sheet when he came out of the Napoli the other night. And Archie McLean, well, everyone knows about that shouting match. But Archie wouldn't hurt a fly for all his bluster. "I know," Hamish said quietly. "That's why I need to find out who really did it." He left Angus's cottage as the afternoon light began to fade, his mind working through possibilities. He needed to see the official files, the autopsy report, the forensics evidence. But Blair would never share that information with him willingly, which meant he needed Jimmy Anderson. He found Jimmy that evening at the Strathbane Police Headquarters, looking harassed and overworked. Blair had him running errands like a trainee instead of the capable detective inspector he was. "Hamish," Jimmy said with relief, "thank God. I need a drink after today. Blair's been impossible." "Come away to the Napoli," Hamish said. "I have a bottle of the good stuff at the station. We can have a wee dram and you can tell me all about it." An hour later, they were settled in Hamish's kitchen, glasses of 12-year-old Talisker in hand. Luggs had his head on Jimmy's lap, and even Sonsie had deigned to sit near the fire and purr. "Blair's convinced he's solved it," Jimmy said, savouring the whisky. Archie McLean had a public argument with Vane. His boot prints were found near the back entrance to the castle, and he was acting shifty the morning after the murder. Blair thinks that's enough for the Procurator Fiscal. "And what do you think?" Jimmy sighed. "I think Archie's hiding something, but I don't think it's murder. The man's terrified of his wife, not the police. And there's the locked door problem. Blair's ignoring it, but I can't. How did the killer get out of that library?" "Good question." Hamish refilled Jimmy's glass. "What did the autopsy show?" Jimmy glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "This is off the record, mind. Blair would have my head if he knew I was sharing case information with you. Understood. Death occurred between 8 and midnight. Single blow to the back of the skull. Delivered with significant force. The peat cutter was definitely the weapon. No defensive wounds, which suggests Vane didn't see it coming. He was probably bent over looking at the lower shelves when he was struck. Prints on the weapon? Wiped clean. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Jimmy took another sip. "There's something else. We found mud and peat traces in the library, like someone had been walking across the moors, but the main entrance to the castle was clean. Whoever came in must have used the back way." "The servants' entrance." "Aye. It leads directly to the old kitchen corridor, and from there you can reach the library without going through the main hall. The door was unlocked." Hamish thought about this. Someone who knew the castle layout, someone who knew about the back entrance, someone who could move through the building in the dark without getting lost. "What about the nephew, Callum Vane?" Jimmy's eyebrows rose. "How did you know about him?" "Never mind. I should know better than to ask. Yes, there's a nephew. Blair's tracking him down now. Apparently there's bad blood over an inheritance. Julian Vane cut him out of his will after Callum ran up gambling debts. That's motive." "Aye, but we need more than motive. We need evidence." Jimmy stood up, swaying slightly. "I should go before Blair notices I'm missing. Thanks for the whisky, Hamish. And for listening. Sometimes I think you're the only sane policeman in the Highlands." After Jimmy left, Hamish sat by the fire, stroking Luggs's ridiculous ears and thinking. The picture was becoming clearer, but there were still too many gaps. The locked door. The mysterious nephew. Dr. Brodie's pale face. Archie's shifty behaviour. And running through it all like a silver thread was Moira Stewart with her helpful lists and her intimate knowledge of the castle. Tomorrow, Hamish decided he would need to do some digging into backgrounds, starting with the good doctor who had looked far too guilty for a man with nothing to hide. He went to bed with his mind still turning over the puzzle, while outside the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves like a restless spirit. In the morning there would be more questions to ask and more secrets to uncover. But for now, Hamish slept the sleep of the determinedly lazy, his animals curled up around him, warm and safe against the Highland cold. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. The following morning dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that made sensible people stay indoors. Hamish, never one to be accused of excessive sensibility when it came to avoiding work, used the weather as an excuse to visit Castle Krag again. Blair and his team had moved their operation to Strathbane, leaving only a single constable guarding the scene. The young man was huddled in his patrol car, looking miserable and cold. "Morning, Donny," Hamish said cheerfully. "Terrible weather to be stuck out here." "Aye, sir," Donny said, perking up at the sight of a familiar face. "DCI Blair said no one's to go in, but it's awful lonely just sitting here." "I'm sure it is. Tell you what, why don't you take a break? There's a tea room in the village, does a grand breakfast. I'll keep an eye on things here." "I shouldn't, sir. DCI Blair was very specific." Hamish pulled out a £20 note. "My treat. And Blair doesn't need to know, does he? I'll just be checking the perimeter, making sure everything's secure. Won't go inside at all." The young constable's resistance crumbled. "Well, "If you're sure, sir. Just for half an hour." The moment Donny's car disappeared down the drive, Hamish let himself into the castle. He moved quickly through the corridors, his long legs eating up the distance. The library door was sealed with police tape, but the rest of the building was accessible. He had been thinking about what Jimmy had told him. Vane had been bent over, looking at the lower shelves when he was struck. What had he been looking for? Or looking at? Hamish ducked under the tape and entered the library. The chalk outline where the body had lain was stark against the Turkish carpet. The blood stain had been photographed but not cleaned. He crouched down, examining the shelves at floor level. The books here were old, leather-bound volumes on Highland history and genealogy. Exactly the kind of thing a corporate auditor wouldn't normally care about, unless there was something specific he was searching for. Hamish ran his fingers along the spines and then he felt it. One book was set slightly forward from the others. He pulled it out and his breath caught. Behind it was a small wall safe, its door hanging open. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. Hamish pulled on a pair of gloves from his pocket and carefully removed the book. He flipped through the pages, and his face grew grimmer with each entry. Julian Vane hadn't been just an auditor. He'd been a blackmailer. The ledger was meticulous. Names, dates, amounts paid, and most damning of all, the secrets Vane had uncovered. Archie McLean's hidden bank account in Inverness, where he'd been squirreling away money from his fishing income. Dr. Brodie's medical negligence case from 15 years ago, hushed up but never officially resolved. A dozen other villagers, all with their private shames catalogued in Vane's neat handwriting. Hamish felt his anger rise. This was why Vane had wanted the harbour sheds and the property deeds. Not for development, but for leverage. He'd been researching the villagers' finances and histories, looking for pressure points. The last entry made Hamish pause. It was dated 2 days before Vane's death. MS. Castle Krag, original family. Father's suicide. Hidden items. Confirmed. Excellent leverage for cooperation. MS. Hamish stared at the initials. Could it be? He was so absorbed in the ledger that he almost didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor. He quickly tucked the book inside his jacket and was examining the bookshelves innocently when the library door opened. Constable Macbeth. It was Moira Stewart, and she looked surprised to see him. "I didn't expect anyone to be here." "Mrs. Stewart, I could say the same. This is a crime scene." "Oh, I know." She gave him that gentle smile. "But I realised I'd left some of my research notes here when I was giving Mr. Vane a tour of the castle last week. I thought I'd retrieve them before they got lost in all the police business." The young officer outside said it would be all right. Hamish doubted that very much, since Donny had been gone for the past 20 minutes, but he said nothing. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." She held up a manila folder. "Just some notes on the castle's architectural history. I'm preparing a talk for the Historical Society." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you? What brings you back here?" "Just checking that everything's secure. Can't be too careful with the press sniffing around." "Of course." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Such a terrible business, this whole thing. I do hope they don't keep poor Archie locked up for too long. Everyone knows he couldn't have done it." "Do they?" "Well, yes. I mean, Archie's all bluster and no action. Always has been. I remember when he was a boy. Yeah, he once threatened to punch Billy Fraser for stealing his fishing spot, but when it came to it, he just stomped off in a huff." She laughed softly. "He's not changed much." "You've lived in Lochdube a long time, then?" "Oh, yes, nearly 20 years now. I came here as a young teacher and never left. It's home." Her grey eyes were warm and sincere. "I can't imagine living anywhere else." Hamish watched her go, his mind working. 20 years. That would put her arrival in Lochdube around the time Castle Krag had changed hands from the previous owners. Back at the police station, Hamish made coffee and settled down with the ledger. He needed to photograph every page before Blair realised it existed. But first he wanted to understand what he was dealing with. The telephone rang. "Macbeth," he answered absently, still reading. "Hamish." It's Jimmy. You need to hear this. We've tracked down the nephew, Callum Vane. He's got a rock-solid alibi. Traffic cameras show his car on the M9 near Stirling at the time of death. There's no way he could have been in Lochdoub. That's unfortunate for Blair's theory. There's more. We've been looking into Julian Vane's finances. The man was loaded, but his money didn't come from auditing. He's been involved in some dodgy property deals over the years. Bought up distressed estates, forced the owners out, then flipped them for profit. Sounds about right for him, Hamish said grimly. Here's the interesting bit. Castle Krag belonged to a family called Stewart back in the 80s. Vane's father was involved in bankrupting them. The father committed suicide. The mother died a few years later. There was a daughter, but she disappeared after the mother's death, about 18 years old at the time. Hamish's hand tightened on the receiver. What was the daughter's name? Hold on, I've got it here somewhere. Maureen. Maureen Ann Stewart. Why? Just curious. Thanks, Jimmy. Hamish hung up and sat very still, staring at the rain streaming down the window. Maureen. Moira. Close enough that a young woman reinventing herself might choose one over the other. 20 years ago, Moira Stewart had arrived in Lochdoub. 20 years ago, Maureen Stewart had lost her family and her home. He pulled out the ledger again and read that final entry more carefully. MS, Castle Krag Original Family. Vane had known. He discovered that his sweet, helpful schoolteacher was actually the daughter of the family his father had destroyed. And he'd been blackmailing her with it. But blackmailing her for what? What could Moira possibly have that Vane wanted, unless it wasn't about what she had, but about what she knew, the castle's secrets, the hidden passages, the layout of the building that would let someone move through it unseen in the dark. Hamish stood up and began pacing, Lugs watching him anxiously. The pieces were falling into place, but he needed proof. He needed to know for certain. And he needed to be very, very careful. Because if Moira Stewart had killed once to protect her secrets and reclaim her heritage, she might not hesitate to kill again. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the village a killer was going about their daily business, teaching children their letters and serving tea with a smile. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. Hamish spent the next day doing what Blair should have been doing all along, proper detective work. He started by paying a visit to Archie McLean in the Strathbane holding cells. Archie looked terrible. His face was grey, his hands shook, and he had the haunted expression of a man who'd been locked in a small room with only his thoughts for company. "Hamish," he said when the constable appeared. "Thank God! You've got to get me out of here. My wife thinks I'm guilty. She won't even visit." "I know you didn't do it, Archie," Hamish said, settling into the chair opposite. "But I need you to tell me the truth. What were you really doing the night Vane died?" Archie's face flushed. "I can't say." "You can, and you will. Because right now Blair's building a case that'll see you charged with murder, and I can't help you if you won't help yourself." The fisherman slumped in his chair. "I was hiding in the pub cellar. All night? Aye, from 8 o'clock until dawn. I know it sounds daft, but I'd had enough of herself going on about the state of the house, and how I spend too much time at the pub and not enough time fixing the gutters. So I told her I was going out for a pint, and then I just stayed in the cellar with a bottle and a blanket. Can anyone verify that? The barman knew I was there. Iain. He brought me down some bread and cheese around midnight." Hamish made a note. It was a ridiculous alibi, but it was also exactly the kind of thing Archie would do, and it could be checked. "What about the boot prints at the castle?" "I was there earlier that day delivering some fish to Mrs. Murray, she can tell you, but I left before dark, I swear it." Hamish believed him, which meant Blair had arrested the wrong man, and the real killer was still free. His next stop was Dr. Brodie's surgery. The doctor was in his office filling out paperwork, and he looked up guiltily when Hamish entered. "Constable, what can I do for you?" "You can start by telling me why you were sneaking around Castle Krag at midnight with a blood-stained sack." The colour drained from Brodie's face. "You saw that?" I did. And before you spin me some tale, you should know I'm not interested in prosecuting you for poaching. I just need to know you didn't kill Julian Vane." Brodie sagged with relief. "God, no. I couldn't kill anyone." "Hamish, You know that. I'm a doctor. I save lives. I don't take them. Then what was in the sack? A salmon. A big one. I caught it illegally, I admit it, but with all the commotion at the castle I panicked. I thought if the police found it during their investigation I'd be in trouble, so I buried it in the woods. At midnight. I couldn't sleep for worry. The wife was snoring, so I thought I'd deal with it and have done. He rubbed his face tiredly. It was stupid, I know, but Vane had been threatening to report me to the medical board over an old malpractice claim. I was terrified any black mark would give him ammunition. What old claim? Brodie hesitated, then sighed. 15 years ago, I misdiagnosed a patient. The man recovered eventually, but there was a complaint. It was investigated and dismissed as an honest error. But these things stay on your record. Vane found out about it and said he'd make sure the board knew I was still practising carelessly, unless I signed over my waterfront cottage to him at half its value. The man was a snake, Hamish said flatly. Aye, that he was. But I didn't kill him, Hamish. I was playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight. You can ask him yourself. Hamish did exactly that. The Reverend, a kind man with infinite patience for his flock's shortcomings, confirmed that Brodie had been at the manse until well after midnight, at which point they'd both gone home. The poor man was in quite a state, Reverend Wellington said. I told him that no good comes from dealing with blackmailers, that he should go to the police, but he was terrified of losing his practice. Strike 2 alibis checked and confirmed. Hamish was running out of obvious suspects. That afternoon Jimmy Anderson called with news. We've located Callum Vane, the nephew. He's agreed to come in for a voluntary interview. Turns out he was in Lochdoub 2 days before the murder, just like your village sources said. What was he doing here? Demanding money from his uncle. The gambling debts are real. He owes some very nasty people in Edinburgh a considerable sum. He thought Julian would help him, family being family, but the old bastard laughed in his face. That would be motive enough for some people. Aye, but he's got those traffic cameras backing up his alibi. He left Lochdoub the afternoon before the murder and drove straight to Edinburgh. His car was picked up on the M9, then the Edinburgh bypass, then parked outside his flat by 9 p.m. His neighbours saw him come home. He was there all night. Unless he doubled back. Can't have. The timeline doesn't work. He'd have had to drive 3 hours south, then turn around and drive 3 hours north, kill Vane, then drive 3 hours south again. The cameras would have caught him, and his car was still parked in Edinburgh the next morning. Another solid alibi. Hamish was beginning to feel frustrated. What does Blair make of all this? He asked. Jimmy snorted. Blair's refusing to admit he might be wrong about Archie. He's convinced the locked door is just misdirection, and that Archie's cellar alibi is a lie. The Procurator Fiscal isn't buying it, though. Not enough evidence for charges. So Blair's going to have to let him go. Eventually. But he's dragging his feet. Hoping something will turn up. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat at his desk and reviewed his notes. 3 prime suspects, all with excellent motives, all with solid alibis. Which left him with a puzzle. If the obvious suspects didn't do it, who did? He thought about the locked door, about the person who would need to know the castle intimately to navigate it in darkness, about someone who had access to the building and wouldn't seem suspicious being there. Moira Stewart fit all those criteria, but Hamish needed more than suspicion. He needed evidence. That evening he drove to the school. The children had long since gone home, but lights still glowed in the classroom windows. He found Moira at her desk marking papers. Constable Macbeth, she said with a smile. This is a surprise. Is something wrong? Just following up on a few details. You mentioned you'd given Mr. Vane a tour of the castle? Yes, about a week ago. He wanted to understand the building's history. I was happy to help. Did you show him the library? Of course. It's one of the most historically significant rooms. The original collection dates back to the 1700s. And did you mention the secret passages? Her smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Secret passages? Goodness, Constable, this isn't a Gothic novel. Castle Krag is just an old building with thick walls and narrow stairs. But there are priest holes, aren't there? Hidden chambers? You mentioned them yourself when we spoke at the castle. I may have mentioned the possibility. Many old Scottish castles have such features. But I've never actually seen any in Castle Krag. She was lying. Hamish could tell from the way she held herself too still, too composed. Mrs. Stewart, how long have you lived in Lochdoub? Nearly 20 years. I've told you that before. And before that? I taught in Glasgow. Why do you ask? Just trying to build a complete picture. You know how it is in a murder investigation. Of course. She set down her pen. I want to help in any way I can, Constable. This village is my home, and these people are my family. The thought that one of them might be a killer is unbearable. Hamish studied her carefully. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression open and concerned. If she was guilty, she was an exceptional actress. One more question. Did Mr. Vane ever mention the Stewart family to you? The original owners of the castle? This time there was a definite reaction. Just a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of her shoulders. Not that I recall. Why? No reason, just something that came up in the investigation. He stood to leave. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Stewart. Any time, Constable. I do hope you catch whoever did this terrible thing. As Hamish drove back to the police station through the gathering darkness, he was more convinced than ever that Moira Stewart was hiding something. But conviction wasn't evidence, and evidence was what he needed. Tomorrow he would dig deeper into the past. Tomorrow he would find the proof that would either clear her name or damn her completely. But tonight he had lugs to walk and Sonsie to feed, and the comforting routine of his quiet life to restore some semblance of order to his troubled thoughts. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a crisp Highland morning that made everything sparkle. Hamish was feeding his sheep when he saw Dr. Brodie's car pull up to the police station. The doctor got out, looking furtive, and knocked on the door. Doctor, Hamish said, walking over with a bucket of feed still in his hand. You're out early. Hamish, I need a word, in private. Inside the kitchen, Brodie paced nervously while Hamish made tea. Lugs watched the doctor with interest, his tail wagging hopefully in case this visitor had brought treats. I've done something foolish, Brodie finally said. More foolish than burying a poached salmon at midnight? Yes, well, related to that, actually. He ran his hands through his hair. The salmon wasn't the only thing I buried. I also got rid of my medical bag. Hamish set down the teapot carefully. Why would you do that? Because it had blood on it. Not human blood, he added quickly, seeing Hamish's expression. The salmon's blood. But I panicked. With Vane being killed so brutally and all that blood in the library, I thought if Blair found my bag covered in blood, he'd never believe it came from a fish. Where's the bag now? In the lock. I weighted it down with stones and threw it off the pier. Brodie looked miserable. I know it was stupid. I know it looks suspicious. But I swear on my medical oath, Hamish, I had nothing to do with Vane's death. Hamish believed him. The doctor was many things, a poacher among them, but he wasn't a killer. He was simply a man who'd made a series of panic-driven decisions that made him look guiltier than he was. You're going to have to tell Blair, Hamish said. I know. I came to you first because I thought you might help me explain it in a way that doesn't make me sound completely deranged. Before Hamish could respond, his phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson. Hamish, get yourself to Castle Krag. Now. We've found something. 20 minutes later, Hamish stood in the castle library watching Blair's forensics team photograph a scrap of paper they'd found, wedged behind one of the bookshelves. It's a threatening note, Blair announced triumphantly. Addressed to Vane, and it's signed with initials, O.M. He held up the paper in a plastic evidence bag. The handwriting was crude, all capital letters. Keep your mouth shut about my business or you'll regret it. A.M. Archie MacLean, Blair said with satisfaction. Finally, solid evidence. The man threatened Vane in writing, then killed him when the threats didn't work. Sir, Jimmy said carefully, the handwriting doesn't match the samples we took from Archie, and why would he sign a threatening note with his own initials? Because he's a simple fisherman, not a criminal mastermind, Blair snapped. Probably didn't even think we'd find it. This is exactly the evidence the Procurator Fiscal wanted. I'm charging him today." Hamish examined the note through the plastic. Something about it bothered him. The paper was too clean, too unwrinkled, as if it had only recently been placed there. And the handwriting, while crude, had an odd precision to it, like someone deliberately trying to write badly. "When was this found?" he asked. "This morning," one of the forensics officers said, "wedged quite far back, behind the third shelf, easy to miss in the initial search." Too easy to miss, Hamish thought, and too convenient that it appeared just as Blair's case against Archie was falling apart. After the others had left to process the evidence, Hamish lingered in the library. He pulled out the book where he'd found the safe and examined the shelf again. Something was different. The books had been rearranged slightly, and there was a faint smell of chalk dust in the air. Chalk dust. Hamish's mind raced. Schools use chalk. Teachers use chalk. He looked more carefully at the shelf and found what he was looking for. A tiny smudge of blue chalk on the wood. The exact shade used in primary school classrooms. He needed to confront her, but carefully. If Moira Stewart really had killed Vane, she'd proven herself capable of planning and deception. He couldn't afford to spook her. That afternoon, he found an excuse to visit the school again. The children were at recess, their laughter drifting through the windows. Moira was in her classroom cleaning the blackboard. "Mrs. Stewart," Hamish said, "could I have another word?" "Of course, Constable." She set down the eraser, leaving a small cloud of blue chalk dust in the air. "How can I help?" "I wanted to ask about Archie McLean. You've known him a long time, haven't you?" "Oh yes, since I first came to Lockdoub. He's a good man, really, just henpecked." "Would you say he's the sort to make written threats?" She tilted her head, considering. "No, I wouldn't think so. Archie's all bluster. If he has something to say, he shouts it at the pub for everyone to hear. He's not the sneaky type." "So if someone found a threatening note supposedly from him, you'd find that suspicious?" "I suppose I would, yes." Her eyes were guileless. "Has someone found such a note?" "They have, actually, just this morning. Very convenient timing." "How strange." She moved to her desk and began tidying papers. "I do hope it doesn't make more trouble for poor Archie. He's suffered enough already." Hamish watched her hands as she worked. They were small and neat, a teacher's hands skilled at writing on blackboards and marking papers, skilled enough to disguise her handwriting if she needed to. "You were at the castle yesterday, weren't you?" he asked casually. "Retrieving your research notes." "Yes, that's right." "And you didn't happen to notice anything unusual in the library?" "No, nothing at all," she smiled at him. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. The note was found in almost the exact spot where you said you had left your folder." For just a moment her smile faltered. Then it was back, bright and innocent. What a coincidence. Though I suppose if someone was hiding evidence in the library, they might choose the same sorts of places. Great minds think alike, as they say. "Or guilty ones," Hamish said quietly. The atmosphere in the room changed. Moira set down her papers and looked at him directly. "Constable Macbeth, if you have something to accuse me of, please do so. Otherwise I have lessons to prepare." "I'm not accusing anyone, Mrs. Stewart. Just trying to understand how a threatening note supposedly written weeks ago only turned up yesterday, in pristine condition, right after the case against Archie started to collapse. Perhaps the forensics team simply missed it the first time. They're only human after all." "Perhaps." Hamish moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. You mentioned you'd never seen the secret passages in Castle Krag. But I've been reading up on the castle's history. There's a very detailed book about it in the Strathbane Library, written by the last private owner, the Stewart family. They documented every priest hole and hidden passage. I'm sure you've read it, being such a keen local historian." Her face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her desk. "I may have glanced through it years ago. I don't recall the details. The author was particularly proud of a passage that runs from the library to the old chapel. We said it was used during the Jacobite risings to hide priests and fugitives. Very useful for someone who needed to leave a locked room without being seen." Fascinating, Moira said coolly. But hardly relevant to a modern murder, surely. Those passages have been sealed for decades. Have they? Hamish asked. Or is that just what people assume? He left her standing there, her face unreadable, surrounded by her neat classroom with its smell of chalk and children's innocence. Outside, Hamish leaned against his Land Rover and took a deep breath. He was getting close to the truth. He could feel it. But he was also playing a dangerous game. If Moira realised how much he suspected, how much he was piecing together, she might do something desperate. He needed to move faster. He needed to find proof of her real identity, and proof that she'd known about the passages, proof that she'd planted that note. And he needed to do it before Blair charged an innocent man with murder and closed the case forever. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the playground. Hamish watched the children playing, so trusting, so sure their teacher was a kind and gentle soul. They had no idea they were being taught by a killer. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Hamish knew he was running out of time. Blair had scheduled a press conference for the following afternoon, fully intending to announce Archie McLean's arrest and charging. The procurator fiscal was wavering, and the planted note might just be enough to tip the scales. He needed to eliminate every other possibility, to prove beyond doubt that only Moira Stewart could have committed the murder. Which meant checking every alibi, every timeline, every detail until the case was watertight. He started with Archie's cellar story. Ian, the barman at the Napoli, confirmed it readily enough. Aye, he was down there all night, Ian said, polishing a glass. Came in around 8, looking like a whipped dog. Said his wife was on the warpath about the state of the shed. Asked if he could hide in the cellar for a few hours. And you said yes? Well, I felt sorry for the man. Besides, it's not like he was causing any trouble. Just sitting down there with a bottle and his misery for company. I brought him some bread and cheese around midnight when I checked on the barrels. You're certain about the time? Positive. I always do my cellar check at midnight, regular as clockwork. And he was there the whole night? Must have been. The cellar door locks from the outside, see? I locked it when I closed up at 1 a.m, and when I opened it the next morning at 7, there he was, snoring away on a pile of empty grain sacks. So Archie couldn't have left the cellar even if he'd wanted to. Strike one alibi confirmed. Next, Hamish drove to the manse to speak with Reverend Wellington again. The Reverend was in his study working on Sunday's sermon. Dr. Brodie was definitely here, Wellington confirmed. We played whist until nearly midnight. My wife joined us for the last few hands. She's a stickler for time, always complaining I keep guests too late. She noted it was 12:32 when the doctor finally left. You're certain? Quite certain. She made rather a point of it. The Reverend smiled ruefully. My dear wife believes that nothing good happens after midnight, and that doctors need their sleep. Hamish checked with Mrs. Wellington, who confirmed the time with the precision of someone who'd been watching the clock and mentally composing complaints about her husband's inconsiderate hospitality. Strike 2. Dr. Brodie's alibi was solid. That left Callum Vane, the nephew. Hamish called Jimmy Anderson. Tell me again about those traffic cameras, he said. Jimmy sighed. Hamish, I've been over this with Blair 3 times already. Callum Vane's car was photographed on the M9 near Stirling at 7:45 p.m, the night of the murder. Then it was picked up on the Edinburgh bypass at 9:15. Then it was parked outside his flat in Leith by 9:30. His neighbours saw him arrive and go inside. And the car didn't move after that. Not according to the parking enforcement cameras. Edinburgh loves its parking cameras, you know that. The car was there all night and into the next morning. Callum himself was seen by neighbours taking out his rubbish at 11 p.m, and his upstairs neighbour heard him playing music until 1 a.m. She complained about it the next day. Could he have taken a train back? Last train from Edinburgh to Inverness leaves at 8 p.m. He'd have had to catch it before his car even reached Edinburgh. And it doesn't arrive in Inverness until nearly midnight. Then he'd need to drive to Lochdew, commit the murder, and get back to Edinburgh. Impossible. Hamish did the calculations in his head. Jimmy was right. The timeline didn't work, unless Callum had an accomplice, which seemed unlikely given his estrangement from his uncle. Strike 3. Every obvious suspect was accounted for, which meant the killer had to be someone else. Someone whose presence at the castle wouldn't raise suspicion. Someone who knew the building intimately. And someone who had been systematically helping the investigation while subtly steering it away from the truth. That evening Hamish sat in his kitchen with the blackmail ledger spread before him, studying that final entry about MS again. He needed to prove that Moira Stewart and Maureen Stewart were the same person. He called an old friend in Glasgow, a records clerk he'd helped years ago with a delicate family matter. "I need you to look up some old school records," Hamish said. A teacher named Moira Stewart should have started working in Glasgow about 25 years ago, before she moved to Lockdoob. "That's a lot of Stewarts," his friend said. "Any other details?" "She'd have been young, early 20s, primary school teacher, and I need to know where she trained, what her references were. I'll see what I can dig up. Give me a day or two." Next, Hamish drove to Strathbane and spent an hour in the library's archives, reading through old newspapers. He found what he was looking for in a yellowed edition from 19 years ago. "Local family loses historic estate," the headline read. The article described how Castle Krag had been sold to pay debts after the owner, Robert Stewart, had been ruined by a failed business venture. There was a photograph of the family, a tired-looking man, a pale woman, and a young girl with serious eyes and dark hair pulled back in a plait. The girl was identified in the caption as Maureen Ann Stewart, aged 18. Hamish studied the photograph carefully. The bone structure was the same, the shape of the eyes, the determined set to the jaw. 20 years could change a person, but these fundamentals remained. Moira Stewart was Maureen Stewart. He was certain of it now. The article went on to mention that Robert Stewart had taken his own life 6 months after losing the castle. His widow had died 2 years later from pneumonia, though the article delicately suggested that grief and poverty had hastened her end. And the daughter? The article said she'd left the area and was believed to be living in the south. No further details. Until she reappeared in Lockdoob nearly 20 years ago, using a slightly different version of her name, taking a teaching position in the village that had once been her family's estate, waiting, planning, biding her time. Hamish made copies of the article and drove back to Lockdoob as dusk settled over the loch. He needed one more piece of evidence. He needed to prove that Moira knew about the secret passages, that she could have used them to escape the locked library. Back at Castle Krag, he searched for the passage Moira's ancestors had documented. It took him 2 hours of examining panelling and pressing stones, but finally, in a corner of the library hidden behind a tall bookcase, he found it. A section of wall that swung inward when you pressed a carved rose in the woodwork. Beyond was a narrow passage, dusty and thick with cobwebs. Hamish pulled out his torch and followed it. The passage sloped downward, then turned sharply. After about 50 feet it opened into what had once been a small chapel, now used for storage. There were fresh scuff marks in the dust. Someone had used this passage recently. Hamish examined the marks carefully. They were small, made by someone with a light tread, and there, caught on a rough stone, was a single thread of blue wool, the exact colour of the cardigan Moira had been wearing the day Vane died. He bagged the evidence carefully, his hand steady despite the pounding of his heart. He had her now. The physical evidence, the historical connection, the opportunity. All he needed was to prove motive, and the ledger entry gave him that. Vane had discovered her identity and was blackmailing her, threatening to expose the fact that her father had hidden stolen artefacts in the castle to keep them from creditors, threatening to destroy her carefully constructed life and her reputation as the village's moral compass. So she'd killed him to protect her secrets and reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. As Hamish emerged from the chapel into the cold night air, he saw a light in one of the castle's upper windows. Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, was still working late. Tomorrow he would have to tell Blair what he'd discovered. Tomorrow he would have to watch as the woman the village trusted and admired was arrested for murder. But tonight he would go home to his croft house, feed his animals, and try to make sense of a world where kindness could be a mask and a school teacher could be a killer. The stars were bright over Loch Dhu, cold and distant and uncaring. Somewhere in the village, Moira Stewart was probably marking papers or preparing lessons, secure in her belief that she'd gotten away with murder. She hadn't reckoned with the lazy constable who preferred sheep to ambition and would go to extraordinary lengths to protect the innocent, even if it meant destroying someone who'd spent 20 years building a new life. Justice, Hamish thought grimly, was rarely simple in the Highlands. Chapter 8. The School Teacher's Flaw. Morning came grey and cold, with a kind of drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. Hamish sat at his desk, the evidence spread before him like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had finally come together to reveal an ugly picture. The newspaper clipping with Maureen Stewart's photograph, the thread from Moira's cardigan caught in the secret passage, the chalk dust in the library, the blackmail ledger with its damning entry about MS and the hidden artefacts, and most telling of all, that perfectly timed threatening note that had appeared exactly when Blair needed evidence against Archie McLean. Hamish pulled out the timeline Moira had provided to Blair on the morning of the murder. He'd glanced at it before, but now he studied it with the attention it deserved. It was meticulously detailed, listing every villager who'd argued with Vane at the pub, noting times and witnesses with the precision of someone who'd been paying very careful attention. Too careful, perhaps. He found the anomaly buried in the middle of the page. Moira had written that Vane mentioned he was reading a book on Highland history and genealogy when she'd spoken to him at the pub that evening. But Hamish had been at the pub. He'd heard Vane's entire pompous monologue about property rights and development. The man hadn't mentioned any book. More to the point, how would Moira know what Vane had been reading in his private library unless she'd been there? Unless she'd seen the book herself when she crept through the secret passage to kill him. It was a tiny slip, and the kind of detail a clever killer might include to seem helpful, without realising it revealed too much knowledge. Hamish was still pondering this when his phone rang. It was his friend from Glasgow. "I've got those records you wanted," she said. Moira Stewart started teaching in Glasgow 20 years ago. Before that, she trained at Jordan Hill College in the early 90s under the name Maureen Stewart, changed it legally to Moira when she qualified. Fresh start after a family tragedy, according to the notes. Did she give references? Just one, from a woman who'd been her English teacher at secondary school. The teacher died about 10 years ago, so I can't verify anything. But the application was approved. And she worked in Glasgow for a year before transferring to Loch Dhu Primary. Why the transfer? Says here she wanted a quieter life in a rural community. The headmaster in Glasgow gave her a glowing reference. Model teacher, devoted to her students, never a hint of trouble. After he hung up, Hamish sat back and thought about that. A model teacher for 20 years. A pillar of the community. A woman everyone trusted with their children. And underneath it all, a patient, vengeful daughter waiting for the chance to reclaim what had been stolen from her family. He was reaching for his jacket when there was a knock at the door. It was Moira herself carrying another basket. "Good morning, Constable," she said brightly. "I've brought you some fresh bannocks. Thought you might appreciate them with your tea." Hamish felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unnerving about her standing there, all sweetness and domesticity, while he sat surrounded by evidence of her guilt. "That's very kind, Mrs. Stewart. Won't you come in?" She stepped into the kitchen, setting the basket on the table. Luggs wandered over to investigate, and she bent down to scratch his ears. Even Sonsi, usually hostile to strangers, allowed Moira to stroke her head. "I wanted to thank you," Moira said, straightening up, "for being so kind about this whole dreadful business. I know it must be difficult for you, having that awful man Blair trampling all over your investigation." "Blair has his methods," Hamish said neutrally. "Though I prefer a more thorough approach myself. Which is why I'm sure you'll find the real killer soon." She smiled at him, that gentle, trusting smile that had fooled the entire village. Poor Archie didn't do it, of course. Everyone knows that. The real killer was probably someone passing through, a vagrant perhaps looking for something to steal. You think so? Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? A stranger would have more reason to kill Mr. Vane than any of us. We're all law-abiding people here in Loch Dubh. Mostly, Hamish agreed. He gestured to the chair. Sit down a moment, Mrs. Stewart. I wanted to ask you about something. She sat, folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl called to the headmaster's office. You mentioned that Vane was reading a book on Highland history when you saw him at the pub, Hamish said. I was curious about that, because I don't recall him mentioning any books that evening. Her smile didn't falter. Didn't he? Perhaps I'm misremembering, or perhaps he mentioned it to me privately when I was trying to calm him down. Perhaps. Hamish pulled out the timeline she'd given Blair. You've been very helpful with this investigation, Mrs. Stewart. Almost too helpful, some might say. I don't understand. This timeline, for instance. Very detailed, very precise, almost as if you'd been taking notes at the time, planning ahead. I simply have a good memory, Constable. It comes from years of teaching. You learn to remember which child was where and when, who started what argument. It becomes second nature. Aye, I'm sure it does. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. I've been doing some reading myself, about Castle Crag's history. Fascinating story, the Stewart family who owned it. He heard her sharp intake of breath, quickly covered. Is that so? Aye. Tragic, really. The father killed himself after losing everything. The mother died a few years later, and the daughter just disappeared, vanished without a trace. He turned to look at her, until she didn't. The room was very quiet. Even Luggs had stopped wagging his tail, sensing the tension. I don't know what you're implying, Constable Macbeth. Don't you, Mrs. Stewart? Or should I say, Miss Maureen Stewart, formerly of Castle Krag? Her face went white, then red, then settled into something hard and cold that bore no resemblance to the gentle schoolteacher the village knew. That's quite an accusation, she said quietly. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. I've seen the records. I've seen the photographs. I know who you are. Hamish sat down across from her. The question is, why did you kill Julian Vane? She was silent for a long moment, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. You can't prove anything, she finally said. I can, actually. I found the secret passage from the library to the chapel. I found threads from your cardigan caught on the stone. I found chalk dust in the library, the same blue chalk you use in your classroom. I found the book on Highland history that told you about the passages. And I know about the artefacts your father hid to keep them from the creditors. They were family heirlooms, she said, her voice shaking. They belonged to us. My father was desperate. He made mistakes. But he wasn't a thief. And Vane knew about them. He was using that knowledge to blackmail you. He was a monster, just like his father. They destroyed my family, took everything we had, drove my father to suicide and my mother to an early grave. And then he bought our home, walked through it like he owned it, mocked me when he realized who I was. Her grey eyes blazed with decades of suppressed rage. He said he'd expose the theft, destroy my reputation, have me fired from my position, everything I'd built, everything I'd become, all gone because of his greed. So you killed him. So I took back what was mine. She stood up, her composure cracking. That castle belonged to my family for 300 years. 300 years, and some London vulture swooped in and stole it because my father made one bad investment. Where's the justice in that? Murder isn't justice, Mrs. Stewart. She laughed, a bitter sound. Isn't it? You didn't know Julian Vane. You don't know what he was capable of. I did the world a favour. Hamish stood as well, his hand moving toward his phone. Moira Stewart, I'm arresting you for the murder of Julian Vane. Wait. Her voice was sharp. You're going to tell Blair? Let him take the credit? I'm going to make sure justice is done. She stared at him, and for a moment he saw the 18-year-old girl who'd lost everything, who'd spent 20 years waiting for revenge. Justice, she said softly. What a peculiar word for it. Then she sat back down, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing more. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish sat across from Moira Stewart in the small interview room at Strathbane Police Headquarters. Blair had been furious when Hamish called to say he'd made an arrest, even more furious when he realised it wasn't one of the suspects Blair had been pursuing. "A schoolteacher?" Blair had bellowed. "You've arrested a respectable schoolteacher on what? Some blue thread and chalk dust? You've lost your mind, Macbeth." But Jimmy Anderson had seen the evidence, read the newspaper articles, examined the secret passage, and Jimmy, for all his faults, knew solid police work when he saw it. Now Blair sat in the corner of the interview room, arms crossed, waiting for Hamish to make a fool of himself. Jimmy operated the recording equipment, his face carefully neutral. Moira looked smaller somehow, as if the removal of her mask had diminished her. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded on the table, her expression blank. "For the record," Hamish said, "you are Maureen Ann Stewart, daughter of Robert and Catherine Stewart, former owners of Castle Krag. Yes. And you changed your name to Moira when you qualified as a teacher. Yes. I wanted a fresh start. I didn't want to be defined by my family's tragedy. Tell me about that tragedy." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "My father was a good man, an honest man. He ran the estate for years, kept it going even when times were hard. Then he met a business partner, a developer from London named Vane. Senior, not Julian. The father. Julian Vane's father. Yes, he promised my father that together they could turn the estate into a luxury hotel. Said there was money to be made from tourists wanting the authentic Highland experience. My father mortgaged everything to raise capital, and then Vane Senior pulled out of the deal, leaving my father with debts he couldn't pay. And Castle Krag was sold to cover those debts. Sold for a fraction of its worth. To Vane Senior himself, as it happens. He'd planned it all from the beginning. Research the property, identify the weak points, befriend the owner, encourage him to overextend, then swoop in and buy the estate at auction." Hamish could see Blair shifting uncomfortably. This was sounding less like murder and more like provocation. "What happened to your father?" "He hanged himself in the old chapel 6 months after we lost the castle. My mother found him." Moira's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "She never recovered. Pneumonia took her 2 years later, but it was really grief that killed her. She simply gave up." "And you?" "I was 18, alone. Everything I'd known was gone, so I reinvented myself, became a teacher, built a new life." She looked directly at Hamish. "And I vowed that one day I would come back, that one day I would reclaim what was stolen from my family." "So you moved to Lochdoub?" "Not immediately. I taught in Glasgow first, saved money, waited. Then a position opened at Lochdoub Primary. I applied, I got the job, and I came home." 20 years ago?" "Yes. I thought perhaps Vane Senior would sell the castle eventually. I was patient. I waited. I watched. I became part of the community, made myself indispensable, and I never forgot who I was or what had been taken from me." Blair snorted. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't prove she killed anyone." Moira ignored him, her attention focused on Hamish. "Vane Senior died 10 years ago. The castle passed to his son, Julian, who was even worse than his father, if that's possible. He let the castle fall into disrepair, used it as a holiday home, showed no respect for its history. And then he decided to sell? No. Then he decided to move here permanently, to finish what his father started, to destroy what was left of the village's character with his developments and his arrogance." Her voice hardened. "And then he discovered who I was." "How?" "He found old photographs in the castle's records, family portraits that my mother couldn't bear to take with her. He compared them to me. It wasn't hard. I look like my mother." She smiled bitterly. "He called me to the castle one evening, said he wanted to discuss local history, and then he showed me what he'd found. The artifacts your father had hidden. Family heirlooms, a silver tea service that had belonged to my grandmother, some jewellery, a pair of candlesticks that had been in the family since the 1600s. My father hid them before the auction, couldn't bear to see them sold off to strangers. He was going to come back for them once he'd gotten on his feet again, but he never got the chance. And Vane used this to blackmail you. He said he'd report the theft to the police unless I signed over my cottage to him. Said he'd make sure everyone knew that the respectable Mrs. Stewart was actually the daughter of a suicide and a thief. That I'd lose my position, my reputation, everything. Her eyes blazed. Just like his father had done to my family before. So you killed him? She drew a deep breath. I went to the castle that night. I knew the secret passages from my childhood. My father used to show them to me, tell me stories about the Jacobites who'd hidden there. I slipped in through the chapel entrance, made my way to the library. Vane was there, reading by lamplight. He didn't even hear me come in. And the peat cutter? It was part of a display of Highland implements. It had belonged to my grandfather. I picked it up, and I thought about my father hanging in the chapel, my mother wasting away from grief, 20 years of exile from my own home, and I struck him. The room was silent except for the soft whir of the recording equipment. Once, Moira continued, one blow, he fell and didn't get up. I dropped the weapon, or wiped it clean with my handkerchief, and left the way I came. I bolted the library door from the inside before I entered the passage. I knew it would look like a locked room mystery. I knew it would confuse the investigation. And then you helped Blair, Hamish said. Provided him with a list of suspects, pointed him toward Archie and the others, even planted that threatening note when his case started to fall apart. I had to protect myself. I'd come too far to fail now. She looked at him steadily. You're the only one who saw through it, Constable Macbeth. You and your lazy, observant ways. Blair would never have figured it out. Oi! Blair protested. It's true, Moira said. You were so busy looking for the obvious villain that you never considered the helpful schoolteacher might be the killer. People never do. We're invisible. We middle-aged women who teach children and bake scones and keep our heads down. The perfect disguise. Hamish leaned back in his chair. You said you wanted to reclaim what was stolen. Did you think murder would give you back the castle? I thought it would give me justice. And it has. Julian Vane is dead. He can't hurt anyone else the way his family hurt mine. She smiled, and it was a terrible smile full of satisfaction. I don't regret it, Constable. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Some people deserve to die. That's not for you to decide, isn't it? Who else would have stopped him? The law? The law didn't help my father. It didn't stop Vane Sr. from stealing our home. It wouldn't have stopped Julian from destroying my life. She stood up, her composure returning. At least now I've had my say. At least everyone will know the truth about the Vane family and what they did to mine. Blair was on his feet too, his face red. Take her to the cells. I've heard enough of this nonsense. Murder is murder, whatever sob story you wrap it in. As Jimmy led Moira away, she paused at the door and looked back at Hamish. Thank you, Constable, she said quietly, for listening, for understanding, even if you don't agree. You're a good man, better than most. Then she was gone, leaving Hamish alone with Blair and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the victim really was a monster, and the killer really was the wronged party. But murder was still murder, whatever the provocation. And justice, Hamish thought wearily, was never as simple as revenge. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. 3 days later, Hamish found himself standing outside Lochdew Primary School, watching the children play in the yard. They'd been told their teacher was ill, that a substitute would be coming. No one had the heart to tell them the truth just yet. Inside the classroom, everything was as Moira had left it. Neat rows of desks, colourful drawings pinned to the walls, a half-finished lesson plan on the blackboard about Scottish wildlife. It looked like she might walk in at any moment, smile that gentle smile, and ask the children to take out their reading books. But she wouldn't. She was in Strathbane, awaiting trial for murder. Hamish had spent the past few days tying up loose ends. Archie MacLean had been released with profuse apologies from the Procurator Fiscal, though Blair had grumbled that the case against him had been perfectly sound until Hamish interfered. Dr. Brodie had confessed his salmon poaching to the authorities and received a stern warning and a small fine, which he paid with visible relief. The village was slowly returning to normal, but normal, Hamish reflected, would never quite be the same. He was heading back to his Land Rover when Jimmy Anderson pulled up beside him. "Hamish, got a minute?" They sat in Jimmy's car, out of the drizzle that seemed to have become a permanent fixture of the Highland weather. "Blair's taking credit for solving the case," Jimmy said without preamble. "Is he now?" "Says his investigation led to the breakthrough that you just followed up on leads he'd already identified. The press are calling him a hero. There's talk of a commendation." Hamish felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so? You're not upset?" "Why would I be upset? Blair gets his glory, I avoid a promotion to Strathbane, and justice is done. Everyone wins. Except Moira Stewart. Aye, except her." Hamish stared out at the grey loch, though I'm not sure she sees it that way. She got her revenge. That's all she really wanted. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "Between you and me, Hamish, I feel sorry for her. What the Vanes did to her family was criminal, even if it was legal." "Aye, it was. But murder's still murder, Jimmy. We can't let people take justice into their own hands, no matter how much they've suffered." "I know. Doesn't make it any easier, though." Jimmy pulled out a flask and offered it to Hamish, who shook his head. "There's something else you should know. We found the artefacts she mentioned. The silver tea service, the jewellery, the candlesticks, all hidden in a sealed chamber behind the library. Vane must have discovered them when he was having renovation work done. What'll happen to them? They'll be held as evidence for now. After the trial, assuming she's convicted, they'll probably be sold to pay her legal fees, unless she has family who can claim them." "She doesn't. She's the last of the Stuarts." They sat in companionable silence, watching the rain streak down the windscreen. "Blair wants you to come to Strathbane," Jimmy said eventually. "Officially hand over your case notes, that sort of thing. Tell him I'm busy with an important investigation in Lochdoub." "What investigation?" McLean's been complaining about her neighbour's cockerel again. Very serious matter. Could take weeks to resolve." Jimmy laughed. "You're incorrigible, Hamish. One of these days your laziness is going to catch up with you." "Let's hope not," Hamish said cheerfully. "I rather like my life the way it is." That evening Hamish sat in his kitchen with a dram of whiskey, lugs at his feet, and Sonsi curled up on the chair beside him. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind howled around the eaves. He thought about Moira Stewart sitting in her cell, probably marking imaginary papers in her mind, planning lessons she'd never teach. He thought about the children who would miss their kind teacher, and the village that would struggle to understand how someone they trusted could have done something so terrible. He thought about Julian Vane, who by all accounts had been a thoroughly unpleasant man, but who hadn't deserved to die with his skull crushed in his own library. And he thought about justice, that slippery, complicated thing that was never quite as straightforward as people wanted it to be. There was a knock at the door. Hamish opened it to find Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, standing on the doorstep with a casserole dish. "I thought you might not have had a proper meal with all this business," she said. "It's lamb stew. Just needs heating up." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Wellington." "Not at all. You've done the village a service, Constable, catching the killer before anyone else got hurt." She paused. "Though I must say it's difficult to believe. Moira always seemed so gentle." "Aye." She did. "My husband says we never truly know what's in another person's heart. Only God knows that." She handed him the dish. "Still, it's a terrible thing. Those poor children." After she left, Hamish heated up the stew and ate it while reading the latest edition of the Highland Gazette. Blair's face beamed from the front page under the headline, "Detective Chief Inspector Crag's Castle Murder Case." The article credited Blair's dogged determination and brilliant detective work for solving the complex locked room mystery. Hamish Macbeth was mentioned in passing as providing local support. Hamish cut out the article and pinned it to his notice board, right next to a cartoon Lugs had once chewed and a reminder about sheep-dipping regulations. And it would serve as a useful reminder the next time Blair tried to bully him into doing something he didn't want to do. The phone rang. It was the superintendent from Strathbane. "Macbeth, I've been reviewing your performance." Hamish's heart sank. Here it came, the dreaded promotion. "Yes, sir?" "I'm afraid your work on this case has been rather disappointing. Detective Chief Inspector Blair reports that you failed to follow proper procedures, missed crucial evidence, and generally displayed the kind of laziness we've come to expect from you." Hamish bit back a smile. "I'm very sorry to hear that, sir." "As am I. I was considering a transfer to Strathbane, but given your poor showing, I think we'll leave you where you are. Clearly you're not ready for more responsibility." "I understand, sir, and I'll try to do better." "See that you do. Strathbane out." Hamish hung up and allowed himself a broad grin. Blair's glory had served its purpose. No promotion, no transfer, no disruption to his comfortable life in Lochdoub. He raised his glass to Lugs. "Here's to laziness, boy. May it keep us in clover for many years to come." Lugs wagged his tail in agreement. Outside, the storm was blowing itself out. By morning, the sun would be shining on the loch again, and the village would wake to another day. The children would go to school, the fishermen would mend their nets, and life would go on as it always had in the Highlands. Moira Stewart would stand trial, and likely spend the rest of her life in prison. The village would whisper about her for months, then years, and eventually she'd become just another story. Another piece of Lochdoub's long and complicated history, and Hamish Macbeth would continue to avoid work, tend his sheep, feed his improbable pets, and solve the occasional murder when he absolutely had to. Because that, he reflected as he finished his whiskey and prepared for bed, was what he did best. Not the solving murders part, which was regrettable but necessary, but the maintaining of balance, the preservation of the village's peace, the quiet protection of the people and place he loved. Some might call it laziness. Hamish preferred to think of it as conservation of energy. He climbed into bed with Lugs settling at his feet, and Sonsi claiming her customary position on the extra pillow. The wind rattled the windows one last time, then fell silent. Tomorrow Mrs. McLean would complain about the cockerel. Someone would exceed the speed limit on the coast road. The Curry twins would report suspicious activity that would turn out to be nothing more than a tourist taking photographs. And Hamish would handle it all with his usual mixture of cunning, compassion, and strategic avoidance of anything resembling actual work. Life in Lochdoub would go on. And that, Hamish thought as he drifted off to sleep, was exactly as it should be.